A little over 3 weeks after Booster 18's failure, SpaceX may actually be on time to finish the next one in line before the end of the year. Simultaneously though, progress with Ship 39 appears to indicate that we may still have to wait a bit longer for its own test campaign ahead of Starship's 12th flight. SpaceX has also undergone further testing in addition to upgrades on Pad 2 in the past week as its long-awaited completion looms near. And all of this is happening while teams are continuing to prepare an entire fleet of vehicles to fly in the near future as construction on production facilities continues both at Starbase and here on the Space Coast. I'm Max Evans for NSF, and as always, we have all of that coming up and more on this week's Starbase Update.
This video has been sponsored by Novium.
In the aftermath of Booster 18's failure during testing at Massey's, SpaceX set out a goal of having the next booster, Booster 19, fully stacked and ready for testing by the end of December. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen that teams have made a great deal of progress there, and it now appears that they may very well be on track to meet that rather lofty timeline. To give further context here, let's quickly dive into the booster stacking process since there's a few extra things needed for version 3 boosters compared to what we've seen with version 2. Boosters are normally stacked in two large sections: the forward section, which makes up the majority of the main liquid methane tank, and the aft section, which corresponds with the main liquid oxygen tank. SpaceX often starts with the aft, welding sections together on the front right turntable inside of Gigabay 1. The aft consists of 7 barrel sections, the common dome section, 5 liquid oxygen tank barrel sections, and the engine section at the very bottom. Once complete, it's moved over to the front left turntable in Gigabay 1, where SpaceX proceeds with the forward end. In the case of the forward section, that one is made out of 3 barrel sections: the forward dome section with its integrated hot staging truss, and the 2 regular steel barrels for the methane tank. Altogether, that's 10 barrel sections, and in the process, there's also some other hardware that needs to be installed, but we'll go into that shortly. But keep that in mind though, it'll come in handy. Normally the aft 2 barrel section, which is right under the common dome, rolls out first, followed by the previously mentioned common dome, and then stacked on top to begin the aft section. For Booster 19, this process started on November 25th, meaning SpaceX had roughly 36 days from the time of stacking beginning to their targeted deadline at the end of December. A rough estimation here translates into 1 barrel section about every 3.5 days, meaning the aft needs to be completed before December 20th to remain on track. The remaining barrel sections for the oxygen tank, which are labeled as aft 3, 4, 5, and 6, rolled out pretty quickly and were stacked underneath each other to make up the majority of the LOX tank. At this point, SpaceX should proceed to installing additional hardware elements that go inside the LOX tank, such as the massive transfer tube and the landing tanks. In the case of Booster 19, SpaceX first rolled out the methane landing tank followed by the methane transfer tube. If you watched last week's Starbase update, we actually featured this. Booster 18's transfer tube was first seen back in July, and it's a beast. It's essentially a Falcon 9 first stage sitting inside of a super heavy booster. Once the transfer tube is inserted through the common dome, it is then welded to the main body of the methane landing tank. The remaining large internal hardware is the LOX landing tank, which, on version 3, sits on the side of the transfer tube near the bottom. Expecting its imminent rollout, our Starbase Live teams pointed our cameras towards Star Factory, where we spotted this very landing tank already placed in the installation jig. The two together were then rolled into the ring yard and then into Gigabay 1. We later saw that Booster 19's LOX tank was off its welding station and in the middle of the bay, indicating that it had already been sleeved around the installation jig. At the time of this recording, Booster 19 remains in this phase, but its engine section has already entered the bay and has presumably been placed on the front left turntable ahead of aft stacking completion. If we no longer see Booster 19's LOX tank in the middle of the bay in the next few days, then it's most likely been lifted and placed onto the engine section for stacking. Actually, by the time you're watching, this could have already happened. So by all accounts here, SpaceX is currently ahead of that rather rough but useful rule of completing the aft section before December 20th. We'll be sure to keep a close eye on any of the forward barrel sections moving into Gigabay 1, as that's the key missing piece of the booster left.
Now, SpaceX obviously has a ton of hardware that might make for a pretty epic memento from Booster 18. Unfortunately though, you can't just be taking components like that home with you. Something you can take home, however, is a pretty epic gadget from today's video sponsor, Novium.
Look, it's the middle of December, and I can guarantee you there is at least one person in this video who has not started their Christmas shopping yet. Fortunately, the sponsor of this video, Novium, wants to help. It can be super tough to find somebody a gift that's the perfect mix of coolness and usefulness. Then you end up giving your wife a leaf blower. Well, the Hoverpin Interstellar has both. I mean, it floats and it writes. It uses sufficiently advanced technology to hover on its base. It's got all sorts of different nods to the science that powers it. It tilts at a 23.5-degree angle, like the Earth. It's got a Time Magazine award. It comes in 4 different colors. Once again, the red one is Mars Magma. And there's a premium version with an actual piece of meteorite embedded in the pen. It's really cool. There's also a Hoverpin Future with interchangeable tips, like an actual inkwell tip if you're into calligraphy or whatever. I would just make a mess. Look around. Anyway, a Hoverpin is a great way to knock a really cool gift off your list. Honestly, one of the best types of gifts to get for someone is something that they might not get themselves. They see it everywhere, they think it's really cool, but are they gonna pull the trigger to get it? That's where you come in. You just order the pin, get the really cool packaging, wrap it up, put a bow on it, and they're like, no way, you got me a floating magnet pin? There's nothing wrong with getting one for yourself if you want. So here's another chance to score an easy win. Use the link in the description or use code NSF to score 15% off a Hoverpin for yourself or a gift for the next 48 hours. You get a cool and useful gift for somebody, you help support us, and we get you back to the video.
Once complete, both forward and aft sections will then be welded together to complete Booster 19's overall structure. However, that still won't be the end of construction though, as teams will need to install some minor but very important components such as raceways, pressure lines, and the booster shines, which hold the composite overwrap pressure vessels, or COPVs. In recent days, we've already seen some of this taking place, even though stacking isn't complete yet, with the booster oxygen pressure lines seen during installation. Now, the reason why it's so important for SpaceX to get Booster 19 stacked so quickly and before the end of December is rather simple. They're still targeting a debut flight of Starship version 3 at some point in Q1 of 2026. It's incredibly important to keep the program on schedule next year in order to fulfill their human landing system contract with NASA and to still have a chance at kickstarting their Mars program during the 2026 window. While it's going to be difficult to get all of this done, they are certainly giving it their all, and if all does go well, we may see Flight 12 sometime in just the next 3 months. Fingers crossed for no more booster sneezes at Massey's, please. And speaking of that, last week we had mentioned that SpaceX had rolled the aft and forward sections of Booster 18 back to the production site following its failure at Massey's. These sections were rolled back to Sanchez specifically, and we presume that they'll be scrapped in the near future. We've even seen workers hanging around the inside of the engine section a few times this past week. Caesar himself also spotted a bunch of Booster 18 COPVs and shine sections being transported out of Massey's as well, as they continue to clear the whole site from its remains. Now, while all of this is happening on the booster side of things, SpaceX teams continue to work on Ship 39, Booster 19's companion for Flight 12, if all goes well. 39 has been on a central workstation inside of Gigabay 2 for a couple of weeks now, and in that time, we've been able to see its thermal protection system, or TPS, remarkably well. There's a few tiles still missing, but overall, it's about as clean as we've ever seen on ships so far. With 39 having been fully stacked for some time already, things may have seemed like they could have been a lot closer to testing by now, but this week we spotted the ship's 2 main raceways being moved into Gigabay 2. These carry the plumbing and wiring it needed to make sure that the ship's main systems function properly, including its own tank pressurization system. So we may have to wait a little bit longer for 39's readiness toward cryogenic proof testing at Massey's. It will also need an available ship thrust simulator stand, and right now, the S39.1 test tank is utilizing it. This test tank was cryo-proofed 3 times last week, but at the time of this recording, it hasn't performed any further testing beyond that. It'll be unique to see what SpaceX does in order to accelerate ship testing, given that we've not yet seen a separate stand for them to be able to carry out similar testing in parallel. Now, earlier I had mentioned the ongoing campaign of the S39.1 test tank at Massey's potentially being in the way for Flight 12. But that's not the only test article over there. 2 booster tanks, B18.1 and B18.3, remain on site. This last week, in fact, B18.3 was tested after nearly an entire month since its last performed test, which happened back on November 17th. This test tank is a version 3 booster forward dome test tank, so any cryogenic time that it undergoes serves to validate this portion of the booster design. As for B18.1, it really hasn't been tested all that much since September 18th, when a big puff of white gas, presumably a leak of nitrogen, was observed. In the time since, SpaceX teams have worked on reinforcing the openings used to structurally test a piece of the methane transfer tube that's inside the test tank to simulate real-world hardware. In the past week, we've also seen some of the actuators for this testing being reinstalled back on the jig where B18.1 is sitting. Each and every one of these steps seems to point towards that further testing is expected at some point in the not-too-distant future. So don't be surprised if we feature a test of B18.1 in the coming weeks. And speaking of further testing at Massey's, this past week, the ship engine test stand was moved. This was the first time that it had moved at all since the Ship 36 explosion back in June. Since then, teams have been removing all of the hardware that was damaged in the explosion, repairing what they could, and installing new hardware to upgrade the site for version 3 ships. If you've been following along in the last several months, you may also know that SpaceX has been doing the same thing for the methane side of the tank farm, which received most of the damage during the event. In our last flyover of Starbase just a couple of weeks ago, we were able to see progress here, as we already mentioned then how close it was to completion. Well, it seems like we were right on top of that, because just a few days ago, we saw the methane tank farm spooling up for the first time since Ship 36's explosion, and actually it spooled up twice. Now, this is great news, as it indicates that Massey's might be able to support ship engine testing again pretty soon, possibly even before Ship 39 is ready for it. Included in the V3 upgrades, SpaceX is also constructing a brand new service structure over the flame trench as well. In the past week, we've now seen that the brand new ship umbilical port has received its flexible hoses that will supply future ships with all the fluids needed to support engine testing. On top of that, a new truss structure is being assembled here as well, which we believe is a brand new addition that was absent from the previous design. This new structure may serve to support access to the ship while out at the stand and outside of testing operations. We often see workers going up on lifts of various sizes to access certain areas of the ship, like the payload bay and the tank access hatches in particular. So with a permanent fixed structure available, this could make things a whole lot easier for teams in the future. But like I said, this is merely a prediction based on what we've observed thus far, and we could be wrong. We'll have to wait and see. And speaking of future ships, at some point their construction will not be limited to Gigabay 2. And of course, we're talking about the brand new Gigabay. For the last few weeks, personnel on the ground have assembled a plethora of steel beams and columns for its different areas. Since our last episode, teams have completed level 2 of the left side when seen from Highway 4. Level 2 of the right side is nearly done as well, and level 2 for the central wall assembly has just started. Once all is said and done, Gigabay should stand up to 5 levels tall, so we're still only about a third of the way up, which is kind of crazy. In order to maintain access at higher levels, these cranes need more structural sections below them so that they can lift themselves up as everything continues. In the last week, teams have brought in the tower crane sections needed to increase their overall height and access. But keep in mind now, Gigabay isn't just going up in Starbase, mind you. There's a second one here at the Kennedy Space Center, and for the time being, Florida is ahead in the race for construction. In fact, it's actually right over there. I can see it. Our very own Julia Bergeron has started a tradition of regularly taking photos of Gigabay process from across the Indian River in Titusville. Since our last update, it appears that teams have moved up to level 3 on the west side of the building while completing the same third level on the middle wall. Of course, this is all in comparison to what we reported on last week on our latest Space Coast update. Go ahead and check that out for a much more detailed update. SpaceX is also continuing progress at Starship's LC-39A launch facility, and in the last week, we've seen water deluge pipes rolling past our Space Coast Live cameras here at the press site heading in that direction. At Pad A itself, we've also seen the giant LR-13000 crane being lowered and disassembled. We aren't quite sure what lies ahead for this gargantuan crane, whether SpaceX is through with it or if they'll continue using it somewhere else. Though it would make a lot of sense to keep it around, as SpaceX has some serious ambitions for other Starship facilities down the road at Space Launch Complex 37. And speaking of, you may recall recently that we covered the release of its final Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS, as well as the Record of Decision, or ROD, which cleared SpaceX to build Starship infrastructure at Space Launch Complex 37. We're still waiting for Pad A's EIS to be cleared, oddly, but that may not be so far ahead. We believe so because the last necessary milestones for this process were completed. According to the project's performance website, the route to this final EIS and the ROD included the consultation with 3 key entities: the Fish and Wildlife Service as part of the Endangered Species Act, the National Marine Fisheries Service regarding the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, and the Florida State Historic Preservation Office to comply with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Geez, what a mouthful. But all three have since been satisfactorily met. According to the timetable on the performance website, the FAA is targeting December 19th for the release of the final EIS and ROD, which will tell us whether SpaceX is approved to continue with Starship development at Pad A or not. Here's to hoping that all is finished on time and I don't have to pronounce any of those agencies and laws ever again. Now, while we all impatiently wait for all of that here on the Space Coast, Starbase teams continue demolishing the old structures at Pad 1 while preparing for all future upgrades that have yet to be introduced. After the removal of the launch mount a few weeks ago, demolition crews have been paying special attention to the massive water-cooled steel plate that once sat underneath it. We've seen them using jackhammers, excavators, and blowtorches pretty heavily, and as a result, a whole bunch of steel has been torn out already. At some point, they're also going to have to start digging in order to start the newest flame trench design that will be used here for future versions of Starship. It's quite the task for teams to plunge through literal tons of concrete and rebar that was laid down when the plate was first installed back in 2023, but for now, we just need to be patient as we already see truckfuls of concrete and rebar leaving the site. Sucks, I know. Moving along, teams have also been removing part of the old tank farm, some of which was used for methane reclamation during prop load operations on prior flights. All of these tanks were eventually rolled out to the port of Brownsville, and at the moment, their destinations are kind of unknown. It'd be interesting if SpaceX wanted to use them on the Space Coast, or if they're just getting rid of them entirely and to be used by somebody else. We all know SpaceX loves to reuse tanks. And while all of that work is ongoing, at the tower, teams continue working on the columns with the movable scaffolding that was set up a while ago. We've also seen that the ends of the chopsticks have now been capped following their sort of decapitation? This likely means that the cutting of the chopsticks is complete and workers can now start outfitting them with the new and updated gear that we've seen on Pad 2's chopsticks and carriage system. On that subject, let's go ahead and take a look at the progress made here since it will be supporting all future launches from Starbase for a good while. In terms of construction, the pad has seen a great deal of work in previous weeks, closing out different structures and preparing it all for booster testing. The launch mount top deck is still crowded with scaffolding, which indicates some more work may be necessary before all is ready. That being said, however, there are signs that all is moving in the right direction, as we saw the lowering of the hold-down arms doors that should be covering them during liftoff. These will retract along with the actual hold-down arms themselves to protect them from the fury of 33 Raptor 3 engines at the bottom of Super Heavy boosters during the initial phase of launch. One of the key advantages of Pad 2's new design is the lack of the Raptor quick disconnects compared to the old Pad 1 design. While these QDs likely simplified the amount of hardware on the booster side, they added more hardware that was damaged during launch, which is kind of a tricky trade-off to manage. Now, all of the fluids that were once supplied by those QDs are going to be supplied by the two booster QDs, one of which will primarily be used to load liquid methane and the other will be used to primarily load liquid oxygen into Super Heavy. Last week, Caesar spotted a really interesting piece of hardware mated on the methane BQD. This piece of hardware is reminiscent of a plate that used to be mated to the BQD on the Pad 1 launch mount between launch and before the next booster would arrive to be tested at the pad. At the time, we theorized this plate might be simulating the shape and form of the corresponding plate on the booster side, enabling SpaceX teams to verify that both designs can be attached properly without leaks. And for all we know, that could very well be the case here. On the tower, teams have fully connected the actual ship quick disconnect arm to all necessary fluid and power lines on the tower after its installation just a couple of weeks ago. The end of the arm is still at Sanchez, and this section is kind of a big deal since it's what holds the actual ship QD plate and will interface with the ship during pad operations. Our field team at Starbase has spotted work on this section, and it seems like it already has the mounting plate for the actual QD umbilicals. We can also see the mechanism that will allow it to either connect or disconnect from the ship during testing and flight operations. We've also observed a lot of work recently on Pad 2's chopsticks. It's kind of interesting because these were actually the third set of chopsticks manufactured, with the first set being at Pad 1 and the second set being at LC39A. And yet despite all these upgrades already implemented here, it seems like more are coming. Its carriage system has also received some extra hardware recently where it connects to the actual tower's cable tray, which is kind of curious. Based on the location and shape, it appears to be a type of control panel, but we're not exactly sure what for. We've also seen a lot more testing of various Pad 2 systems this week, including another run of the water deluge through the actual flame trench. They've tested the system pretty thoroughly so far, especially in comparison to what we saw when SpaceX first implemented the water-cooled steel plate at Pad 1. However, for Pad 2, we're probably up to well over a dozen of these conducted tests, and we've still yet to see the full testing of the actual top deck of the launch mount. It'll be really sweet whenever that happens. Oh, and recall back to when we talked about workers tearing apart some concrete at the air separation unit last week? Well, it seems like they actually repaired whatever was problematic and re-poured a bunch of concrete this week. After a few days, it was cured enough that they were actually able to install the air compressor motors that will be used here. Now, let's wrap up with our McGregor Minute, because if there has ever been a place where we always see engine testing, it's SpaceX's McGregor test site, just a few hours north of Starbase. Since we checked in last week, SpaceX has conducted 13 Raptor tests. 5 of them were the usual 115-second duration at the Raptor vertical stand, like we've seen for the last 2 or 3 months. We've theorized that these might be acceptance testing for flight engines. The other tests included 2 regular firings at the Raptor North and 6 tests at the Raptor South stand, which also included a brief relay test, which took place on December 9th. Something else that we've seen recently here is the addition of new hardware likely to give SpaceX the ability to fire for longer than what we've seen in previous weeks. This past week, we saw a pump and a motor being installed at the Raptor North stand, something that was followed by the installation of a tank close to the stand just a few days later. Hopefully, all of these upgrades will help increase the testing cadence, especially since earlier this week, we saw 5 Raptors being trucked out of the site at once. Only one engine had its serial number visible when they rolled by, but it turned out to be a record for the highest Raptor 3 serial number that we've seen, and for the most engines that we've seen trucked around McGregor at once. We're sometimes asked why they're actually trucked around, and honestly, the reason is pretty simple. There's a bit of distance between the actual storage hangar and where the test stands are located. It makes sense, as you don't want to have your highly sensitive and potentially dangerous engine testing happening in close proximity to either hardware storage or personnel office space. For longer trips like those to and from Hawthorne or Starbase, SpaceX uses a specially covered truck to protect the engines during transport, since both are obviously much longer trips. Before closing out here, I should mention that SpaceX has removed the actual methane landing tank test article from one of McGregor's test sites. If you remember, this is the one located adjacent to the large mystery structure. This area is well known for having carried out subscale testing of Starship hardware in the past. It might be safe to assume that with its removal, testing is already complete and is no longer needed there, which bodes well for the validation of version 3's newly designed booster transfer tube and landing tank. As usual, we will keep a close eye on any other hardware that might appear on site and also around Starbase. Here's hoping by next week we'll have a lot more clues about Booster 19's timeline of progress and that everything remains on track for Flight 12. We sure hope so, as SpaceX cannot afford the troubles they had with version 2 considering the actual deliverables at play here. That said, we cannot wait to see how version 3 will all come together and perform.
Thanks again to Novium for sponsoring today's video. Be sure to check out the link in the description to get 15% off your order with the code NSF for the next 48 hours.
I'm Max Evans for NSF. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.